Hey there, folks. Before we get into the video, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who came before me when it comes to researching this case. In December of 2019, a brilliant journalist by the name of Ellen Killoran began a multi-part written series on the disappearance of Steven Kubacki. It was essentially a hobby project that she posted about on her substack. The work she did on this case was excellent and helped me greatly in the creation of this video. She was incredibly thorough in her research and tracked almost every angle of this case to its logical conclusion. When I began considering making a video on the disappearance of Steven Kubacki, I tried contacting Ellen multiple times to see if she wanted to work together. I never received a response, and one of her email addresses even sent me a message saying that her inbox was full. Something about that didn't feel right to me, so I decided to do some digging. That's when I found out that Ellen Killoran passed away earlier in that year, 2022. So if you watch this video and you find out that you are interested in this case, please check out Ellen's series, which I will link in the description. Her work was truly exceptional, and in a way, I'm only following in her footsteps and furthering this investigation because she no longer can. So Ellen, this episode is dedicated to you. And let's begin by telling the incredibly unusual story of Steven Kubacki. Steven Kubacki grew up in South Deerfield, Massachusetts with his mother Irene, father John, and brother John Jr. Early on in his youth, it became apparent that Steven had quite an intellect. Though he grew up in a blue-collar home, Steven was able to achieve a full scholarship to the prestigious Deerfield Academy, where he participated in a number of extracurricular and sports activities, including cross-country skiing and mountain climbing. After graduating from Deerfield, Steven would move out of state to attend Hope College in Holland, Michigan, on the shores of one of the Great Lakes. Here he would decide to major in history with an emphasis on the German language. Hope College professor G.L. Penrose, who taught Steven and was his advisor, said Steven was very intense and very, very bright. He was intellectually engaged in a number of things. He was always intensely involved. He was not your average student in terms of intellect. He is much brighter. Steven did not live on campus, and was also rumored to have been a big Dungeons & Dragons guy, a label that perhaps contributed to some at Hope College who would refer to Steven as weird. During this time, he still kept up his physical activities as he enjoyed skiing around the frozen shores of Lake Michigan. Steven also liked to walk out on the lake ice, sometimes going as far as 2 miles according to friends. Around 1976 to 1977, he took an opportunity to travel abroad and went to study and also teach English for a time at the University of Freiburg in Germany. It was here that Steven met a woman and the two kindled a romance. Rumor has it that it was one of the university's professors. While in Europe, he still continued his sporting ways by climbing mountains, skiing, and running regularly. In all, Steven would spend 18 months studying in West Germany. By 1978, Steven had returned to Hope College, leaving behind his girlfriend in Germany. Steven's parents had separated and were no longer living together. He was 23 years old and only 9 credits away from graduating in February of that year. By this time, Steven knew that he had an aptitude for writing, having penned an op-ed in the school newspaper the year prior. He already had a job lined up with the Holland Sentinel newspaper after he graduated. The day of February 18, 1978 did not have the makings of anything special. About a month prior in January, Holland was hit by a terrible blizzard, later known as the Great Blizzard of 1978. By February 18th, it was still cold with plenty of snow on the ground when Steven told his roommates that he intended to go cross-country skiing, something he often did. His route was a roughly 6-mile distance from Holland to a beach on Lake Michigan. When Steven left that day, His roommates never thought twice about it. Steven would leave Holland and head down near the old St. Augustine Seminary in Saugatuck. The snow was plentiful and the lake mostly frozen, the perfect area for his chosen activity, though this time he would not be returning home. 2 days later, on February 20th, around 11 a.m., a few people were out on their snowmobiles in the area of the St. Augustine Seminary. It was here that they came across a strange sight. Laying near the snowy shores of Lake Michigan, they spotted a pair of skis with a backpack laying on top. On either side of the backpack was a ski pole, purposefully placed in the ground. As if that wasn't weird enough, they saw a set of tracks in the snow. They led from the backpack and out onto the ice, but there was no set of tracks coming back. The tracks went out on the ice some 200 yards. The snowmobilers would call the local police, and it wasn't long before they figured out who the gear belonged to. Steven Kubacki had already been reported missing by his roommate after he didn't return home. A search was immediately initiated for Steven. The strange sight near the shoreline made it appear as though Steven may have fallen through the ice and drowned. They followed his tracks out on the ice as far as they dared, but found no returning tracks. Police told reporters that there is a very strong current in the area, and much of the ice is broken and piled up. They would later say it was likely that Steven had fallen through the ice. Steven's parents immediately flew out to Michigan to help look for their son. John Kubacki Sr. didn't believe his son was dead, describing him as an expert outdoorsman. Steven's brother would tell reporters that it was unusual for Steven's backpack to be found with the skis. He had known Steven to keep his backpack on, even if he left the skis behind, because it contained his compass and essential items. Helicopters were called in to search from the air, while ground teams looked for any traces on foot, 3 miles in every direction. Tracking dogs were brought in, but they had no success. By February 22nd, authorities were already calling off the search as nothing had been found. Steven's parents pleaded with the state governor to grant an extension. They were given a few additional days, but it didn't help. The search was restarted once the ice on Lake Michigan had melted, with hopes that a body may show up somewhere along the shoreline. The renewed search turned up absolutely nothing. State police were so at a loss that they even sent Steven's dental records to Chicago authorities to see if he might have been among the bodies discovered in the home of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. This avenue of investigation also turned up nothing. Later that June, Hope College awarded Steven an honorary bachelor's degree, in absentia. The degree was accepted by his parents. After both searches turned up nothing, Steven's parents began to consider the possibility of foul play. They hired Theo Grievers of Fat Man International Private Detective Service to assist in helping them find their son. They would spend thousands of dollars in the effort to find their child. The state police kept telling Steven's parents that he was dead, that he must have drowned. They didn't want to believe it, but what choice did they have? Steven appeared to have vanished off the face of the earth. Over a year later, on May 5, 1979, a man wakes up in a meadow outside Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The man doesn't know where he is or how he got there. He's wearing clothes he doesn't recognize, and a shirt from a marathon in Wisconsin. He finds a backpack laying nearby. Inside are new clothes, equipment, and eyeglasses, as well as maps to a number of different places, including San Francisco, Chicago, Sacramento, Utah, and Reno. He deduces that these things must be his, but he can't remember how he acquired them. He wanders for a time, eventually coming into the town of Pittsfield. Here he stops a passerby and inquires, "What place is this?" He is told that he is in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He then buys a local newspaper. When he sees the date on the newspaper, a host of memories come flooding back to him. He is Steven Kubacki, and the last thing he remembers is cold, darkness, and being afraid on the ice of a frozen Lake Michigan. Steven realized that more than a year had elapsed since that day on the ice, but he had no idea where he had been or what he had been doing. Steven found a bench across from a friendly's restaurant and sat there for hours, contemplating his situation. He decided against immediately telling his parents, worrying about what effect the news might have on them. Instead, he realized that his aunt, June Bozek, lived about 20 miles away in Great Barrington. Steven began walking the road in that direction, holding out his thumb for every passerby in an effort to hitch a ride. Eventually, a man stopped, picked him up, and the two began driving to Great Barrington. The driver dropped Steven off in downtown Great Barrington, still some distance away from his aunt's house. Steven walked around for a while, feeling scared to reconnect with his family again. He then went to his aunt's house and knocked on the door. At the time, June Bozek was visiting a neighbor when she saw a man approach the door to her home. Eventually, she realized who it was she was looking at, but couldn't believe her eyes. She exclaimed to her neighbor, "That is my nephew." June then ran to her home to meet Steven. From here, Steven's aunt made contact with his parents via telephone. At some point, Steven would come on the line and let them know he was alive and safe. Steven was reunited with his father in Massachusetts. Cameras were present to capture the moment and many others of Steven with his father. Steven can be seen still wearing the backpack he woke up with. There was a media frenzy. Everyone wanted to know how this could happen. A young man, missing for 14 months, suddenly wakes up 700 miles from the point he disappeared and remembers who he is. Steven's mother would tell reporters that she didn't have an explanation for her son's disappearance and didn't need one. She said, "It's really just grand. The world is a great place again." Steven's father would tell reporters, "I'm very happy. I just don't know what to say, but I'm not pressing him too hard for details." It was clear that all that mattered to Steven's parents was that they had their son back. The incident caused speculation from psychologists as to the cause of Steven's amnesia, though no one could give a genuine diagnosis without actually meeting with him. Some unnamed psychologists threw out theories related to psychological stress, depression, or a problem Steven was trying to flee from. Still other psychiatrists expressed doubt as to whether such memory loss could have occurred at all. Steven would say that he was under no stress and had no problems at the time he disappeared. He was quoted saying, "I don't feel there was anything, but that doesn't mean anything. That's the problem. I may have been under emotional stress, but I can't remember it. It may be a part of the repression." Steven would also defend himself by saying, "My father was going to sign over our house to me. I had 3 courses at school and no trouble. I left a romance in Germany. There was no trouble with girls. I had a job lined up with the Holland Sentinel newspaper." The onslaught of reporters began to bother Steven. Everyone wanted an interview. He would end up taking his father's car and disappearing again in order to avoid the media. Eventually, news topics moved on to other subjects, and the disappearance and reappearance of Steven Kubacki made its way into history as a bizarre and unexplained incident. Steven Kubacki has given few interviews since he reappeared, and essentially none since the first few months of his return. Let's examine what Kubacki did say to reporters immediately upon his return. "I was lying on the grass in a meadow when I woke up Saturday morning. I didn't know where I was. I was wearing clothes that weren't mine. I started going through a pack that I assumed was mine, and I found maps. I would guess I was hitchhiking. I didn't know what the date was until I walked into town and got a newspaper." Kubacki also said he had really vague feelings. "I have some running shoes. I feel like I've done a lot of running. I also have a marathon t-shirt from Wisconsin. I don't know how I got it. I was confused by all the hugging and kissing. I couldn't feel like I had been gone that long, but I'm beginning to understand. I'm amazed, learning about all the money they spent looking for me and about graduating. I don't know what I'll do now. I've got a lot to think about. I'll try and find out where I was and what I did. My parents just never believed I was dead. It's just great to be home." Steven also put forth a theory as to what may have happened. "The only thing I can think of is what mountain climbers suffer from a loss of body heat and exhaustion. That combination can result in a temporary loss of memory." At the time, Steven said his plans were to stay here for a while and possibly visit friends. Many newspapers reported that Steven would definitely not go see a psychiatrist about the situation. A day or so after the initial interview, Kubacki once again talked with reporters and appeared to change his mind about some things. He said, "I want to get to the bottom of this. I'll consider undergoing hypnosis, but not right now. I want to investigate this and try to jar my own memory. If that doesn't work out, I'll probably see some kind of psychiatrist." He would go on to say that he would make plans to reconstruct the trek that he took across the United States, saying he wanted to piece this thing together myself. In another interview, Steven would say, "I felt like it was the Twilight Zone or science fiction, where all of a sudden people are misplaced in a strange land." In describing his last memory while walking on the ice, he recalled remembering the strange and spectacular shapes in which the ice froze. He also noted that he walked farther than ever before and lost his way. The next thing he remembered was waking up in a meadow in Pittsfield. Even later, in June of 1979, he seemed to have changed his mind some more when the Boston Globe interviewed him at his father's home. Steven said he remembered no more now than when he awoke, but that he is not concerned about it. He has no interest in tracing the year lost out of his life. The paper goes on to report that Steven is running 6 miles a day, is trying to put together a book of poetry, and is preparing to return to college to earn credits for a legitimate degree. In the space of a month, Kubacki went from being absolutely determined to find out what happened to no longer caring at all. The police reports for this case, at least for me, have been a sort of enigma themselves. Granted, this case is now quite old, but still, some of the reporting on this case seems so unusual I had to know what the authorities actually found. I contacted every local police department, sheriff, and state agency in the area that I could think of, trying to find somebody who had records for this incident. All of them came back saying they had nothing, including the state police. Because of Ellen Killoran's series, I knew that the Michigan State Police held some sort of records. It took numerous tries, however, before they finally gave them to me. The photocopies of the 16-page, brittle-looking report seemed like quite the prize. The incident report shows that state police received a call on February 20th from a group of 6 snowmobilers who came upon a suspicious situation while out on Lake Michigan shore. A backpack, skis, and some tracks. The police report also helps pinpoint the area where Steven's gear was found. It was this beach here where the tracks were found leading into oblivion. Today, it is Saugatuck Dunes State Park. When a trooper arrived on scene, the men said they had followed the tracks out onto the ice for about 300 yards and passed the first wave of ice on the lake. When Lake Michigan freezes, it can create some pretty incredible landscapes. The men stopped when they encountered a second wave of ice as they were afraid of falling into a crevice and the ice was getting thin. The trooper notes that the lake ice appeared very rough, and some of the ice was about 30 to 40 feet high and covered in snow. He notes the area is isolated, and the backpack and tracks were partially snow-covered upon arrival. He also described the exact position of the equipment. The skis side by side, facing the lake, about 8 inches apart. The ski poles were stuck into the snow upright on the outside of the skis. The backpack was sitting on top of the skis. Very purposefully placed. One of the skis bore the initials SRK, and the inside of the backpack he found a dentist bill for Steven Kubacki from February 3rd. Also inside the pack were a pair of black insulated gloves, a brown bag containing a lunch, some rolled up plastic bags, a plastic canteen, a cigar box containing miscellaneous items, a notebook with loose sheets of writing paper, college handout material, and a drawing pad. Afterwards, troopers checked for Kubacki at his home and also learned that nobody had seen him. A witness who was interviewed stated that the last time they saw him was in downtown Holland. Kubacki had told him he was going skiing and did not appear despondent. When troopers interviewed Kubacki's roommate, he told them that he is sure Kubacki went through the ice, but also stated it was rather odd, and it would not surprise him if Kubacki took off to parts unknown and made it look like he had fallen through the ice. He went on to say that he is sure this is not the case, however, because Kubacki would have consulted him beforehand. He told police about 2 times prior where Kubacki left suddenly to travel. Both times he consulted his roommate who gave him money. The roommate stated that he had gone with Kubacki to the lake shore before, and had stayed on the beach while Kubacki walked onto the ice and out of sight for an hour or so. He said Kubacki enjoyed being out on the ice and being by himself. Troopers next interviewed a woman who knew Kubacki. Her name has been redacted. She said the last time she saw him was Friday evening, the day before he went missing. She said he was in good spirits and was telling her of his plans for the coming week. Because of this, she felt that he must have fallen through the ice and did not intentionally disappear. State police also received information from a couple who were in the Saugatuck area the day Kubacki disappeared. They observed a young couple on the ice. The boy was climbing on the pack ice and the girl was taking his picture. They attempted to caution the boy, but he said he was experienced and not afraid of heights. They described the boy as having a reddish pimple face, a tan ski jacket, and a cap with words on it. He was with a short girl with long dark hair. It seems unlikely that this was Kubacki, however, because the facial description does not seem to match, nor does the clothing. Kubacki was last seen wearing a red parka, blue jeans, and ski boots. When troopers asked Kubacki's friends about who the girl might have been, they both said Kubacki did not have any girlfriends in the States, but he did have one in France and 2 in Germany. They had no idea who the girl could have been. Kubacki's mother, Irene, called state police on March 6th to report a family friend who had been receiving phone calls asking them to call Steven at a specified number. When they tried calling that number, they were advised that it had been disconnected as of September 1977. Irene stated she had received a call from Steven in September of 1977 from that same number. Irene wanted state police to find out who was making the phone calls. An officer contacted the phone company and confirmed the number was disconnected and then assigned to an unnamed individual, but they could give no further information as to who might be making the calls. Officers next asked an individual at Hope College if they knew who would be making the phone calls. They stated that Steven Kubacki's friends were weird and that he hung around with a group of 20 or so different kids who were not the normal type of student. He was uncertain who might be making the calls, but he thought it possible it was one of these friends. A Holland police officer also confirmed that he was familiar with the group of students Kubacki hung around with, and that they were a weird bunch, not normal, and that anything was possible with this particular group. Sometime in early March, an officer called the dean of students at Hope College to ask if he knew the whereabouts of an unnamed female student, possibly the friend troopers interviewed earlier. The dean said she was still enrolled at Hope College, but is now living with an aunt in Grand Rapids. She had not attended classes for the past 2 or 3 weeks. After Kubacki was reported missing, she became very upset, and there was an indication she considered ending her own life. Little is known about the incident, but it makes one wonder if this unknown female and Kubacki may have been dating. In late March, Theo Grievers, the private detective hired by the Kubacki family, went and talked to state police about the case. He said that Steven's brother, John Jr., did not believe that his brother drowned, but believes he left the area, possibly to Germany. He believed his brother would have flown Icelandic Air out of Chicago, Illinois. Officers contacted Icelandic Air and confirmed that no Steven R. Kubacki had flown with them between February 17th and February 21st. The report ends with Sergeant Charles Keebler writing that he was informed Kubacki showed up at home on May 5, 1979, with memory loss. This point will be short, but will also come back later on. A unique article for the Recorder in Greenfield, Massachusetts, quotes a man named Robert Neate, who described himself as a close personal friend and former classmate at Hope College. Mr. Neate described Steven as highly intelligent, saying that he was not surprised by what happened to him. He continued, Kubacki and two other students started an underground newspaper that was off the wall. It was very political and very anti-establishment, like something out of the 60s. Mr. Neate would go on to say that he attended a political science class with Steven, and he dominated the discussion to the point where he needed to be dismissed from the class. Neate said that about a week before he disappeared, he made a videotape during which he said he was leaving the country. He said he hated this country and liked Europe. I believe he has been out of country. Neate claimed that the videotape was played throughout the Holland, Michigan area after Steven was reported missing. In response, Kubacki denied most of Neate's claims. Though he acknowledged making a videotape prior to his disappearance, he says it only contains stories about his time in Germany. An interesting counterpoint to the whole Steven Kubacki story comes from an article in the Mississippi Sun-Sentinel on May 24, 1979. The article, written by a trustworthy contributor by the name of Fonnie Black Ladd, and titled Eerie Amnesia Episode Recalled, brings some interesting information to light. Mr. Ladd recounts Steven's story as told nationally in newspapers, but then goes on to state that Sergeant Charles Keebler of the Michigan State Police told him that medical records and police records document the fact that Steven Kubacki was injured in the head during a ski accident on the shores of Lake Michigan. He states that Steven was hospitalized and then later released in satisfactory condition, and was considered by authorities as having returned to his home. Mr. Ladd seemingly makes the argument that Steven Kubacki's entire situation could be chalked up to a head injury he sustained. How Mr. Ladd was able to come into this previously unknown bit of information is also uncertain. Sergeant Charles Keebler was indeed involved in the investigation into Steven Kubacki's disappearance, but nowhere in the state police records is there any mention of Kubacki ever sustaining a head injury. Sergeant Keebler went on record with a number of different reporters and never mentioned this information, only saying that the state police assumed Kubacki had fallen through the ice and drowned. Was Mr. Ladd simply able to contact Sergeant Keebler and interview him to get this tidbit? There was no reason not to believe Fonnie Black Ladd, but there was also nothing corroborating his reporting either. Medical records for Kubacki would be impossible to get now due to privacy rights. But it is possible that police would have had access to them, especially after Steven was thought to be dead. Perhaps Sergeant Keebler shared a private bit of information with Mr. Ladd that he thought was off the record. A reporter from the Athol Daily News did contact Steven's doctor, Stefan Wolanski, and asked about the disappearance and amnesia, but the man could not talk about a patient's medical history. Dr. Wolanski did say he, Kubacki, is a regular guy. It's unbelievable. I'm glad he's back. Of course not, he's never had anything like this happen to him. In the end, even if it is true, the fact that Steven Kubacki may have hurt his head at some point in his life does not mean that his injury was responsible for his disappearance. Mr. Ladd gives no details on the severity of the supposed head injury. It is just one point among many to consider in this disappearance. When Steven Kubacki woke up near Pittsfield, he eventually began hitchhiking to Great Barrington. Once news broke of Steven's story, a 28-year-old divinity student at Berkshire Christian College named Ronald Curtis came forward saying he was the one who gave Kubacki a ride, and he never mentioned anything about waking up with amnesia. The two rode together on Route 7 from Pittsfield to Great Barrington between the time of 6:15 p.m. and 6:45 p.m. That Saturday evening, Ronald Curtis said that Steven told him his name was Nathan and that he had hitched a ride to San Francisco and had flown back before taking a bus from Boston to Pittsfield. Mr. Curtis was quoted saying, "He was able to tell me that the bus cost $8 between Boston to Pittsfield, and he said that he was surprised when he got here that milkshakes only cost 75 cents because they were over $1 in the Midwest and West." The newspaper confirmed that the bus fare between Boston and Pittsfield was indeed around $8. Mr. Curtis would say that Steven told him his aunt, June Bozek, was actually his friend, and that he had some information for her concerning a mutual friend of theirs who had been missing for some time. He was concerned about the reaction she would have to such news. After visiting Miss Bozek, he expressed a desire to go home to South Deerfield, where he said he hadn't been in a long time. Mr. Curtis would go on to say that Steven had told him he had traveled to San Francisco to learn from an Eastern religion cult in the Bay Area. Mr. Curtis was quoted, "He told me he was an unbeliever. Then he told me he had become involved in an Eastern religion cult while in San Francisco. He told me he had no intention of joining, but had gone there with the intent to learn." Mr. Curtis would go on to say that Steven seemed coherent and not disoriented. He would end by saying, "I'm inclined not to believe him, but I'm not willing to make an accusation without the facts. Maybe it was amnesia causing his confusion. I feel bad for him because no matter how it turns out, he's stuck between a rock and a hard place." Kubacki would tell reporters that he didn't remember saying anything like that to the driver that picked him up, but also said, "I am not denying that I may have." He also said that his recollection of the conversation was, "I talked to him, he knew my aunt and that she moved. He knew where she was. The rest of it doesn't make any sense, I just don't remember it. I don't understand what he doubts. I don't know him. I did hitchhike, but I don't know who it was. It could have been him." When Steven woke up on the grassy knoll in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, he was wearing a shirt from a marathon in Wisconsin. Steven himself would also say he felt like he had done a lot of running, and even had the shoes to do it. It seemed to make sense that the marathon shirt he was wearing came from a marathon he may have entered. Narrowing that down is actually pretty easy, as the only marathon in Wisconsin at the time was the Pavo Nurmi Marathon. Ellen Killoran was the first to track down the list of participants in the 1978 Pavo Nurmi Marathon, and I was also able to get my hands on a copy. Much like her, I discovered that there was a Kubacki on the list, and also a number of Stevens. None of that means much, as it would be unlikely for Steven to have used his real name, whether he had amnesia at the time or not. But when Ronald Curtis picked Steven up on the side of the road, he told him his name was Nathan. Unfortunately, the closest thing to Nathan on that list was a gnat from Japan, which is unusual in itself as most runners were fairly local. Still, there was no apparent smoking gun in the long list of marathon runners. Did Steven Kubacki run this marathon in 1978? Is his pseudonym somewhere in this list? Perhaps we'll never know. Today, Steven Kubacki lives in the Seattle, Washington area, working as a psychologist of all things. He has a PhD and a website for an app called Great Date, where he has articles written about relationships and dating. His main website, StevenKubacki.com, was taken down relatively recently. While editing this video, I discovered that Steven Kubacki's website has returned and reflects updates on his life and work. On it, he had many articles that he had personally written about ideas of God and existence. In fact, he even co-authored a book, Metamathematical Foundations of Existence. It is an interesting read, to say the least. On his website, he describes himself as a believer in praxis, or the making real of ideas and imagination through some form of action. He has become rather notorious for ignoring requests to speak on his disappearance. Ellen Killoran tried contacting him to no avail. I tried contacting Steven in the past, not even asking any questions about his disappearance, but I still never got a response. If you look online, though, you may come across a book called The Quantum Biography of Steven Kubacki by author Dylan James Quarles. The book purported to be written by a friend of Steven Kubacki and promised a tell-all type book that left no questions unanswered. But I noticed the ad for the book had been sitting for some time with no book published. If the book's description was accurate and true, then it in itself really provided some important details to the overall story. I contacted Mr. Quarles and asked him to show me, if he could, that the book was indeed real and that he was friends with Steven Kubacki. Mr. Quarles emailed me back saying that Steven told him I could send him an email and that he would confirm that the book is indeed real. Mr. Quarles then gave me Steven's email address. It was the email address I already had on file for Steven, but from which I had never actually received a response. When I sent him an email this time, though, I actually received a response, which went as follows. Hi, Nick. Thanks for your inquiry. You are correct in assuming I generally don't respond to anyone in regard to my disappearance, but that's all changing since I've decided to publish a book about it with Dylan Quarles. And I'm a bit older now, 68. It's getting close to being finished along with a traditional book proposal, so we can shop it around to agents and publishers. So, the book is absolutely legitimate, which leads me to another point we need to cover. The website promoting the book also had a very enlightening description of what the contents would cover. Starting with Kubacki's birth in 1954, the story is told in parts, relying on a mixture of conversations between Steven and I and narrative vignette. Alternate timelines are explored, bolstered by Steven's own assertion that our universe is at best incomplete, and at worst, inconsistent. Picture a newborn, unheld for 6 weeks while his mother recovers from pneumonia. Picture a young man, at odds with his working-class family, receiving a scholarship to the prestigious Deerfield Academy. Imagine the cultural upheaval of the early 1970s, as seen through the eyes of a college student experimenting with mind-expanding substances. Travel to the University of Freiburg in Germany, where an affair with a beautiful professor brings Kubacki into the company of revolutionaries and radicals. And finally, follow the events which lead to that day in 1978, when Steven Kubacki skis out onto the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan and vanished without a trace. If we take this description and combine it with everything we've learned so far, what do we have? Fair warning, from here on out I'm going to be giving a lot of my own opinion on this. There tends to be 3 camps of people when it comes to the disappearance of Steven Kubacki. Those who believe he actually had amnesia, those who believe he was taken by aliens or something paranormal, and those who believe he faked the whole thing. In a case like this, you have to look at, was he the type of person to fake his disappearance? Was he capable of doing it? Did he have reason to do it? Did the people around him even consider that a possibility? Steven Kubacki, a highly intelligent young man, at odds with his working-class family. He attends the Christian Hope College, but does not conform to their conservative values. He experiments with mind-expanding drugs, travels to Germany, where he has an affair with a professor while hanging out with revolutionaries and radicals. He returns to the U.S., and a classmate says he is involved in an underground newspaper that is highly political, that he made a video saying he wants to leave the U.S. and live in Europe. Everyone who meets him talks about his intellect, and that he would be someone capable of vanishing on purpose. And one day, he does. When he returns over a year later, Ronald Curtis, the man who gave him a ride, talks about a Steven Kubacki who went to the Bay Area in California to learn from a Eastern religious cult, that he traveled around the country hitchhiking, and that he was going to a home of a friend, actually his aunt, and that he had information for her concerning a mutual friend of theirs who had been missing for some time. But Steven denies it all. Consider this. If Steven Kubacki went out on the ice and actually blacked out, then how did he live? Did he go on autopilot and walk right out of there? If you are so cold that you are starting to get brain damage, you're probably already close to death. It seems like he either walked out of there on his own tracks or he was abducted by aliens. And I'm hesitant to believe the latter. He was a very experienced person at walking on that lake ice. He could have faked his own disappearance if he wanted to. And once he comes back, why doesn't he take any interviews? If you had faked your disappearance, would you want to admit it? Admit to putting your family and friends through that. Admit that the police and even your parents put thousands of dollars and countless hours into searching for you. In the last interview Steven gave to a newspaper before going silent, he said he was no longer interested in finding out what happened to him. I don't know about any of you, but if I vanished for over a year and couldn't remember anything, I would dedicate significant time and resources to finding out what actually happened to me. So why wouldn't Steven? Is it because he remembered it all? Well, it's become quite clear that he does remember now. At least he said as much to me in a subsequent email. And of course, there wouldn't be much of a book to write if he didn't have memory of what happened. I have a hard time imagining an answer to this enduring mystery that's anything other than he planned it all. Though I could be totally wrong. Sometimes when you're working with limited information, you can't see the answers to some of the more mysterious questions. Maybe Kubacki had a reasonable response to many of the questionable items we've gone over. And what is exciting is the fact that Steven is now willing to tell his story. So the truth, or at least Steven's truth, will eventually come out. Once Steven Kubacki and Dylan Quarles release this book, the mystery will be solved. I don't know about any of you, but I'll be there to grab a copy and see what truly happened on the Lake Michigan ice 45 years ago. And until next time, thanks for watching.